who say they have found strange creatures on Mars. There is no group that would be happier. And that's the quote from NASA. And this comes from the Daily Mail. Now, this is pretty opposite of what you just heard from Russia Today. I like Russia Today. They're a very reputable news source. A lot of my friends have done interviews there, such as the Honorable Paul Hellyer, the former Defense Minister of Canada. And it's a great place. So when I hear something from there and then hear the opposite from the Daily Mail, makes you want to think. But again, it's all a mystery. We won't know until we're actually there. Here comes the final piece of news, and this I really would like to see footage or find first-hand testimony of someone who is actually there. Now, this could just be made up by a conspiracy theorist, but somehow it made it to the Inquisitor. Here goes. Russians shoot down alien UFO over Iran. Putin deploys special forces to recover massive UFO debris. Now, we know in 1986 there was a apparent crash where actual debris sits in a museum in Nevada. And then, of course, there was another crash in the 50s before that. And then I think there was something even later. But 1986 was a very pivotal year because there actually exists debris that is here in the good old US of A. Now, before we get started with our awesome guest, I want to might as well spill the beans. We're going to be speaking about a very, very controversial figure, Aliester Crowley. A lot of people know him as the Great Beast 666, which is a title that he actually gave himself. He was also labeled as the wickedest man who ever lived. But on the other side of the coin, listen to this. In 2000, the UK ranked the top 100 Brits of all time. Guess who appeared on the top 100 list? None other than Aliester Crowley. And even the Beatles used him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So it's really interesting. And just before we introduce our guest, let me give you guys a backstory because, see, I have family that is deeply afraid of 666. I've even had a family member change a credit card because 666 was on it. So I did some digging, right? And what I found was that 666 is actually bogus. And here is why. If you all remember, the Revelations, where it talks about the mark of the beast, was written by Apostle John in, I believe, AD 90, around there. He was 90 years old or 92 years old. And he wrote it when he was blind, either 90, like I said, in his 90s, living in a cave by himself on the island of Patmos. Now, obviously, writing then was very difficult, and you can't really expect something like that to survive very long. Well, the oldest copy of the Revelations is actually a 7th-generation papyrus that resides in the British Museum, dated to 400 AD, so about 350, 320 years, somewhere around that range, after the Apostle John wrote it. When it talks about the mark of the beast, it doesn't give you 3 numbers. It actually gives you 3 Greek letters. The Greek letters are, in order, He, which is the equivalent of H, Xi, which is the English equivalent of X, and Sigma, which is the English equivalent of S. So HXS, right? That's what those 3 numbers came out to, or 3 letters. Then, when the Bible was translated into Latin, the 3 Greek letters ended up turning into 616. Only when the Bible was translated into English did 616 become 666. So technically, if you look at the oldest living or oldest copy of the Bible, of the Revelations, there is no 666. So I just wanted to say that I've done that research, and if you guys can find anything that contradicts this, I would love to see it. And you can Google 666 Papyrus British Museum, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about for yourself. The actual piece of papyrus that is sitting in behind glass in the British Museum, and they highlight the area that's right after Mark of the Beast. With that being said, I would like to introduce our guest today, who happens to be a professor, among other things, an author of several books, but the book that we're going to be speaking about today, which all this pre-talk that I was talking about 666 and Aliester Crowley is leading up to, is Secret Agent 666, Aliester Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. And I thought that was such a fascinating book, I had to speak to the author. And sure enough, he agreed to the interview, and here he is. His name is Dr. Richard Spence. Dr. Spence, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Dr. J. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's actually a pleasure to have you on. I know I told you this story off air, and I'll tell everybody out there. Several months ago, I was, interested in just finding out more about this wickedest man who ever lived. So I went out and got the book. And sure enough, as I'm reading it, the publisher gets me a book. So I was like, okay, that is synchronicity where I have to talk to this guy. But let me ask you, Dr. Spence, and from now on I'll call you Richard if you don't mind.
Sure.
How did you get interested in basically the occult and specifically Aliester Crowley? And then how did that end up taking you into the path of British intelligence?
Well, let's lay some background for this, I suppose. My main research interest, if there is one, really tends to fall into the area of modern espionage. And, and then you begin probing into 20th century espionage, and you then find your way into British intelligence very quickly, since they are quite good at it, or at least they have the reputation for being quite good at it. Back around 2000, I was actually finishing up another book, and actually when dealing with another spy, and it's another book and another topic entirely, a guy named Sidney Riley. But in the process of that, what I was doing is I was looking around World War I New York, which doesn't sound like it would have much to do with the war, but actually it does. And one of the things I knew existed there was that there was a British intelligence presence in New York. And so I was working through the people who were connected to this. And one of the things that I was aware of, I have to say that up to that time, I knew who Aliester Crowley was. I'd never really researched him. I'd read a couple of biographies on him. I mean, I thought he was interesting, but he wasn't in any way really what I was interested in. I didn't see him coming, I guess. So what I was doing is that I knew that Crowley, in the years after that, just in case your listeners don't know this, one of the key points here is that Crowley spends all of World War I in New York. Goes there in the fall of 1914. He's there through the end of 1919. So while the war is going on in Europe, while his native country, Britain, is at war, he's in New York doing all kinds of stuff, and we'll get to some of that. But he had claimed in his later writings, every now and then when people began sort of, I think, picking on him or particularly trying to go after his patriotism, he would insist that he had served the interests of the British government in America during the war. And it was one of those things that I don't think anybody ever took very seriously. And it was something that I didn't expect to find much of. But I found it was interesting because I was sending off for files from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And back in that period, back in, let's say, the First World War period, the FBI, as it exists now, really didn't. There's a thing called the Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't even the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was quite small, and it wasn't the sort of main, let's say, equivalent of Homeland Security. That instead was a thing called, it was actually part of the U.S. Army, called the Military Intelligence Division. So all of the old Military Intelligence Division files are kind of interesting. Most intelligence or security-related files tend to stay secret forever, or at least for a very long time. But all of the old MID files, the Military Intelligence Division files, had been transferred to the National Archives. So you can, there's actually an index. They're like the old index cards are there, and you can find all of the suspects and anybody who was investigated. So I thought, I don't know, I was looking at a variety of British agents or people connected to it. Riley himself was part of this, which is why I was interested in it. And I thought, I know Crowley was there. Maybe, let's see if MID had a file on it. So I actually sent off that request with a set of others. He was the only person I was looking for, and lo and behold, it came back that they did. It wasn't a very big file. In fact, as files goes, it was a pretty small one, and it recounted American agents, MID agents, and others who were following Crowley around, and he was under suspicion because all of his behavior up to this time, this is 1918, by the way. This is like 4 years. This is towards the end of the war. And America had come in the year before, and so they'd taken an interest in him because up until that time, he'd been rather obvious in his association with Germans in New York. And he, in fact, had written blatantly anti-British propaganda that was published in a pro-German magazine. In fact, the magazine's title was The Fatherland. I don't think it gets any, perhaps more German than that. But he had written, rather scurrilous attacks on the king and fictionalized accounts of a Zeppelin attack destroying London. But nevertheless, and this is what makes it odd when Crowley years later would go, well, I was really loyal. I was really serving His Majesty's government at that time, no matter what it appeared. And it's easy to see why people would dismiss that as just sort of self-serving, a fiction that he was spinning. So I got this file, and I'm going through it, and there are people following him around, and at one point, it determines that the Americans were suspicious enough of his activities that they're going to arrest him. Well, 2 people intervened to prevent that. Well, let's say 2 entities intervened. The most important of them was the British consulate in New York City. And what had been learned from there is that they said that he is an employee of His Majesty's government, and the consulate is aware of his activities. So we know what he's doing. It's okay. He works for us. That was what really attracted my attention, because it wasn't what I was expecting. I thought he was making this stuff up. And suddenly that sort of changed things, because it certainly cast into a completely different light the later statements he would make about working, or at least collaborating, with British intelligence. And then I began to pay more attention to a couple of names that he dropped in. And one of the names that he would refer to was a fellow by the name of Admiral Guy Gaunt. Crowley, a couple of times in the 1920s, would basically insist that, well, if you really want to know what I was doing, Gaunt could attest to this. As far as I know, Gaunt never publicly did, but he may have privately. Well, who was Guy Gaunt? Turns out, in the research I was doing, I'd already run across him. He was the head of British naval intelligence in New York. In fact, at one point early on, he was the chief of all British intelligence in New York.
Wow.
So the mere fact, but this was one of the things that's not public knowledge. So the mere fact that Crowley knew who he was suggested that he's not just pulling these names out of the hat. So that really got, and one of the things that came out of this is that I took what I found, because I thought, this is kind of nifty. This is, I can make an article out of this. And so, in fact, I wrote an article, and in 2000 that appeared in a magazine called the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, one of those scholarly journals that virtually no one reads. But in this case, people did actually read it. And what happened, I can sort of thank the internet for that, because what people did is that they, in complete violation of any kind of copyright laws, sort of took that article and began disseminating it across the web, which, by the way, was perfectly okay for me because I didn't get paid for it, so it didn't make any difference to me. And that sort of it gave this article a sort of life of its own. And by the way, all the article said is that, well, when we go through this and we look in this file, basically, it turns out that Crowley wasn't completely making this up, but I hadn't gone any further with it at that point. It simply sort of demonstrated that his claims to have had some kind of wartime connection with the British government and intelligence had seemingly had some sort of basis. Oh, and I should mention, I said there were 2 people who sort of came forward to defend him. The other was an American, who was a deputy attorney general for the state of New York, a guy by the name of Alfred Leroy Becker. I don't know whether he'll come in later in our discussion or not. But he again came forward and said, Crowley has come to me. He's given me information about German activities and agents. If you look at the list of, and Becker was in fact heavily involved in investigating German intrigues and espionage. And if you look at the people he was investigating, they're kind of the same people that Crowley had been hanging out with for the last 4 years. So that again, not only was Crowley cooperating cooperating with British intelligence, or was an asset of British intelligence, but he also was cooperating with American intelligence and security officials as well. So that sort of cast him in a different light. So I had the book I was working on to complete, and I actually had another project that I was going to do after that, and that got completely sidetracked. In fact, I've never gone back to it to this day. Because what I began doing, because that article had been disseminated, I started getting emails from people, basically. And some of them would go, that was an interesting article, are you going to do any more with it, are you going to carry this on any further? Because this sort of, seems to cry out for more examination. And initially I was saying, well, no, I didn't really plan to do any more with it. And then the other thing you get are little bits and pieces of information. Well, if you're curious, you might look at this person, or you might look at the memoirs of that person. But basically, as that came in, I was gradually persuaded, I guess it was a good idea, that I should really put aside the project that I was planning to work on, and they've really done a fair amount of research on already, and delve deeper into this. And it took me a while to really convince myself that there was enough there for a book, but lo and behold, that's the way that it turned out.
Well, you found a lot, though.
Well, and there's more stuff. I'd add that there's little bits and pieces that have come in since I finished the book that I could add to it as well. And, we might get around to mentioning there's a couple of mysterious characters I couldn't figure out, and at least one of them I think I have figured out who the person was. There's also a kind of disclaimer that I have to put in at the beginning. I think it's important for your listeners to know. I'm not a follower of Aliester Crowley. I am not a Thelemite. I've met a number of them. They've all seemed to be basically perfectly nice, normal people. I've gotten basically nothing but a good deal of support on that end of things, I think. No one has come forward and made any other issues out of it. I am sort of dealing with the center of their religion. Crowley is one of those people that tends to polarize people. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that certainly you noted early on is that the wickedest man in the world, let's see, what is it, arch occultist of the 20th century, arch Satanist of the 20th century. He's always accused of being a Satanist. Well, like I said, I knew something about him. I set out to learn more about him. I was sort of cautious in the way that I approached the existing biographies, though, because what I tended to find, this isn't true for all of them, is that the existing biographies of Crowley, which, again, I'd argue that if any of your listeners really want to know more about this guy, read everything you can get your hands on, okay? Don't just read my book. By all means, read it. But read, if you're really interested in him, you need more than one perspective on him. And you tended to find that people either treated him as a kind of, saint or a devil. That's about it. Okay? Either he's an evil occultist, he's a wicked man, or he is a misunderstood genius, and really the fellow who is an almost Christ-like figure. There's not much in between.
That I actually have to second that motion, and that's why how I ended up on your book, because I was just interested in knowing who is this wickedest man that is, I've never heard of up until a year ago, and just like you said, it's either really good or really bad, and I've never even met any of the Thelemites. And for those of you listeners out there who don't know, he founded his own religion called, it's based on Thelema, which is a Greek word for I want. And like you said, the Thelemites is what they are, but the actual lodge that he formed was, if I'm not mistaken, the OTO?
Well, the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, he sort of takes that over. He doesn't actually form it. Somebody else forms it. And then he becomes the head of it in the 1920s. And it had really been formed in Germany back earlier. So he takes it over. And he takes over most of it, but not all of it. And that's why if you look around today, there are these warring OTO factions. Which, by the way, is one of the things that I went out of my way to avoid. Because I knew, in fact, I had people who pointed out to me that there are a lot of factional disputes and there are personal disputes. And it can be, the problem is that if you take help or get help from one person, you've immediately alienated someone else. So in actually writing the book, I deliberately steered clear of that. There were people from the Thelemite and before and afterwards who were very helpful. But I wanted to, that wasn't the aspect that I was interested in. So I guess when it comes down, something could be asked is that, well, do I really think that Aliester Crowley possessed supernatural powers? Did he raise demons? I will proclaim myself a complete agnostic on those questions. I neither deny them, nor I wasn't there, so I don't know.
Yeah.
That's one of the issues. But that wasn't the thing. I don't reject their possibility. Those in and themselves don't have that much to do with what I was looking at. So one of the things, my book is not a complete, it's not a thorough biography of the man. I'm looking at particular incidents in his life and how they related to actual or possible intelligence activities. There's a lot more that certainly could be said about it. But I don't take, I think, I'll kind of pat myself on the back a little bit because I come out of it, I think, taking a fairly objective view of him. I neither see him as a saint or a devil. He was a guy that had a lot of, he had a unique personality. On the other hand, he was very popular with people. He also alienated, it seemed to me, just about everyone he ever met. He was a man who retained very few friends to the end of his life. And that was largely because of his really kind of horrible behavior towards people on some occasions.
But he was very connected with a lot of people. That's why your book, I was so drawn to it, because I love the fact that there has an element of espionage. That's actually the sole reason I was looking at this, because when I interviewed Peter Levende a few months back, and we talked about the occultism in the Nazi Germany, of course, Crowley came up, and that's when I sort of put two and two together. I said, I got to go back to Dr. Spence's book, because, that's the only book I found that actually links the fact of Crowley, being alive during World War I and World War II, and knowing all these great people, important people, both in the UK and, of course, in Nazi Germany, and having such influence over so many people. And the part that I liked the most about your book was the fact that he was possibly a double agent.
Or triple agent.
Triple, that's right. That's right.
You run into a lot of those. Rarely are things in the intelligence world as clear-cut as they appear. In fact, I remember a kind of aphorism that somebody gave me once. He was an old, he'd spent part of his career in the U.S. counterintelligence career and in post-war Germany. But he goes, there's one thing we were always told: nothing is what it seems, except when it is exactly what it seems. And the trick is being able to tell the difference between those two. And so that's what I sort of thought, and looking at, this one document I discovered that said that, yes, the British consulate says he's working for them, and they know all about what he's doing. And then they kind of urging, and I also admit, curiosity on my part to find more about it. So I plunged into it, and that was the place to begin, because that was the one. It was wartime New York. By the way, when America is still neutral, that's something that, many of your listeners may know, but it's one of those things that's overlooked. The United States spent most of World War I as a neutral country.
That's right.
So the war began in 1914. The U.S. doesn't enter until the middle of 1917, and it's over by the end of 1918. Now, that means that while the government was nominally, and I would emphasize nominally, neutral, a lot of other interests in the country were not. And maybe a very important one is that one of the interests in the United States that was not neutral at all was J.P. Morgan and Company, the 500-pound gorilla of Wall Street. And immediately, J.P. Morgan, the money trust on Wall Street, aligned itself with the Allies, with Britain and France, and plays a very important role in financing their war efforts. So one of the things that happened is that this turned America into a propaganda battleground between the British, primarily, the French to a lesser degree, and the Germans. And because the Germans were, the Germans had good reason to be, let's say, annoyed by the fact that billions of dollars of American money and American production was going into producing bullets and shells and rifles for the Allies, and they couldn't tap into that. And therefore, that's one of the reasons they started doing things like using submarines to sink ships full of munitions going from America to Europe. So there's a very active sort of secret war which is going on. It literally is. It's a secret war with its own battles and casualties, sabotage, which take place between German agents and primarily British agents who are opposing them. And this is what Crowley was mixed up in. And one of the things that I found is that when he came to the U.S. in October, I always loved this part of it. He arrived in the United States on October 31st, 1914.
Halloween.
Okay. And aboard the Lusitania, a ship which half a year later was going to become infamous for being sunk by a U-boat off the coast of Ireland. So it's one of those things that, I guess it's just coincidence, but it sort of sets the stage for what happened. Now, Crowley, by upbringing and by ancestry, is thoroughly English. There is really nothing Irish about his family at all. There are people with the same surname in Ireland, but arguably it's a different surname. But that's not his part of it. He comes from an English background, actually a fairly well-to-do family. Also, this is one of the little things I found interesting. He came from a family of what we would now describe as fundamentalist Christians.
Yes. So he went the opposite route, really.
Well, sort of. I mean, there's different ways of looking at this. His father, they were a sect called the Plymouth Brethren, which are probably still around. And the Plymouth Brethren were, fire and brimstone evangelicals. The basic idea pretty much was that they were the elect and everyone else in the world was going to hell. It was a very strict hit. His father, the Crowley family, inherited much of their money from the liquor business, basically. They made ales. I think there are still Crowley ales that there were, and brewing business. They were brewers. His father basically quit the brewing business, or wasn't involved in that, and used the money to be a kind of full-time evangelist. So his dad was a fundamentalist preacher. He was very, very close to his father, who died when he was a fairly young age, and he seems to have had a rather more troubled relationship with his mother, who lived a very long time after that. But that's the whole kind of environment that he comes out of. And later in thinking about it, well, it first seems that, his father was a fundamentalist Christian minister. He comes from a fundamentalist Christian background, and Crowley certainly seems to go in a very different direction towards occultism, maybe towards diabolism, certainly towards what you might call some sort of neo-paganism. He's very different in that sense, but there's a similarity. And the similarity is that both he and his fathers are preachers of the gospel. In one sense, he follows directly in his father's footsteps by being a religious entrepreneur, a preacher in that sense, a preacher of a different doctrine of his own, but still sort of doing what Dad did. And I think it's one of those things, without getting, all pseudo-Freudian about it, but it doesn't take too much to guess that religious upbringing was something that then influenced him later on, which I think sort of pointed, in a way, his fundamentalist upbringing was what led him to occultism, the search for spiritual knowledge, I guess.
Now, he wasn't even born Aliester, right? That was a name he chose.
No. In fact, he is always legally Aliester is a name that he adopts, I think, when he goes to Cambridge, and it's this, it's his version of Alexander. So it's actually a kind of version of his middle name. His real name is Edward Alexander Crowley. And in all of his passports, legal documents, when he goes bankrupt in Britain in the 1930s, everything legally dealing with him, he's always Edward Alexander or E.A. Crowley. Which also brings up this kind of interesting thing, and it's an aspect in a lot of historical figures that I'm interested in, is that what we often see when we look at an historical figure is we see a kind of performance that they're putting on. And I can give you an example of that from something else. The guy who seems to be infinitely popular for some reason, Adolf Hitler. Okay, everybody knows who Hitler is, and almost everybody can probably think of the general image of Hitler, which is shown up if you see any kind of news program, documentary. Well, there's Adolf Hitler, and what you'll generally get is this picture of him delivering a speech at the Nuremberg rally.
Yes.
Where he's got his hands clenched in front of him, and he's, almost like this ecstasy of giving his speech. And that's the kind of general image that we have of Hitler, that he was a guy always on the edge of hysterics, or that he had a little flecks of foam in the corner of his mouth. We always think of Hitler as the fellow who's giving this, these grand gestures and this kind of enraptured speech. Well, he wasn't that way all the time. That's the performance that we're looking at. That's a politician on a stage in front of thousands of people putting on an act. One of the things that, of course, that really is more interesting is what the Hitler or any characters are like when they're off stage. So that's something else that in the book and in working through Crowley, I always began to consider, and it's one of these little intriguing parts that still interests me. How much of this wickedest man in the world, how much of the arch Satanist, how much of the fellow in, the typical picture of Crowley with his bullet head, or shaved, bald. He actually had hair, and he just chose to wear it that way. I think he was balding and decided to shave the rest of it off. But how much of all of this was a kind of act? I mean, was Aliester Crowley a role in some ways that was played, a character played by Edward Alexander Crowley? Which was the real person? When did they change back and forth? Did Aliester Crowley completely subsume Edward, or was it the other way around? And that was one of those things that brings up the idea is that what you're seeing, that this kind of the almost caricature of this person, the Aliester Crowley sorcerer and magician and occultist, may not really have been the real person at all, or may only have been an aspect of that person, which then leaves all other kind of aspects. And that sort of fit into this idea, well, within his occult activities, within all of these other things that he was doing, was there an intelligence dimension to them? So this brings us back to the fact that if he's working for the British government in wartime New York, what was he doing, and who was he doing it with? That was my point, and that then led me, to go back and look at the early part of his life, and the other thing you figure out is that you have to look at every person they meet, every person they refer to, and then figure out who those people are and who they know.
Well, he did a lot of world traveling, so he absolutely met a lot of people.
He traveled most of it. I mean, the other thing that he was, in the years before the war, early on in his career, he's one of the things he prided himself on is that he was a chess player, a very good one. Maybe not as good as he thought he was, but certainly of championship level. And then the other thing was that he was a mountain climber. He was an alpinist.
Oh.
And he was involved in some of the early, I think he was one of the first attempts to conquer K2. I
didn't know that.
Which ended in this horrible disaster in which a number of people died. But he was that. I mean, he was, as a young man, this is the type of thing, one of the images that Crowley tends to come across is almost a kind of Jabba the Hutt image, okay? Obese, bald-headed, pointed head. And, true, he put on weight as he got older, and lost his hair. much of his physique, but he was actually a rather large, athletic, physically robust man, which may explain why he could often attract people around him. And in particular, his, what still strikes me is his seemingly bizarre attractiveness to women.
Yes.
And,
he had a lot of them, that's for sure.
He had a lot of them, and there's always this argument that he drove them all crazy or to alcoholism, which is not true. Some of them.
His wife.
But,
wasn't his wife committed for alcoholism?
His first wife, Rose, basically became an alcoholic. I mean, that probably, one of the whole sort of tragedy in that marriage was that she gave birth to a daughter who died as an infant.
Ah.
And that was really on one of their trips. That was when they were off. I don't know if it was more normal in Edwardian days to take a woman and a small child on a trip to Burma. But as they were off traveling around Asia, and he always, at one point they separate, if I recall correctly, and Rose takes the child, and then the child gets sick and dies. And it always seems that he blamed her for that. He could never quite forgive her for what he thought was her, and I think that was connected to, he believed her drinking was a part of it. Which sounds funny for a guy who, was a pioneer in recreational drug taking, and he really was. But, for spiritual purposes, usually, but, and also I think just because they made him feel good, but, and I think another wife later on in the 20s is committed to an insane asylum. The debate here can be whether or not they were driven to madness by him or they were already pretty far there, and he just kind of pushed them over the edge. Maybe it has something to do with the type of women who were attracted to him. I don't know. They seem to come in a variety in this case. But he did have, one of the things that Crowley had, you may not see it in the pictures, was, what we would tend to think of as some form of sexual magnetism. Single women, young women, older women, married women, sometimes not women. All of them were attracted to him in that way. And it was something that he pretty ruthlessly exploited. But we get back to this question, what could the British possibly be? I mean, one of the arguments, one of the things of resistance I had to this is that, okay, here's a guy who's he wasn't as, let's put it, he was not as notorious in 1916, let's say, as he would be a decade or 20 years later. So he was not quite as well known in that period. But nevertheless, in British official circles, for anybody who paid much attention to it, he had, created some bad impressions. And that's probably the reason why he didn't get something that he wanted and expected when the war broke out. And that was, he wanted to get a commission. And probably a commission, what would have been typical for someone like him, was to get a commission in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, the RNVR. And one of the things that I found is that lots of people are recruited into that from civilian life and then are used in intelligence purposes. And there are a lot of other things as well. Now, one of his close friends, one of his few close friends in that period, was another Englishman by the name of Everard Fielding. And Everard Fielding got a commission in the RNVR. And in fact, Everard Fielding becomes, in fact, Crowley's case officer within naval intelligence. He's certainly the one. Fielding got Crowley the spy gig, is maybe one that he's certainly the person. He had good influence. It was at this suggestion that Crowley then goes off to New York, and they needed eyes and ears there, and they needed people who could figure out what the Germans were doing and who could find their way into their confidence, and that's exactly what he does. So Crowley shows up. Go back to that doomed Lusitania on Halloween 1914, and Aliester Crowley comes down in the gangplank into New York. And one of the first people who receives him, and he mentions this in his autobiography is a guy by the name of John Quinn. John Quinn was an Irish American. He was a prominent lawyer in New York, very well connected. He also, as the name might suggest, was Irish. Well, I mentioned he was Irish American, and he was connected with the Irish independence movement, or in fact the Irish political movement. So Quinn was friends with various people who back then were called Fenians, essentially the early equivalent of the IRA, Irish nationalists. Now this gets kind of tricky because in their desire to free Ireland from English rule, these Fenians, Irish nationalists, were making common cause with the Germans. And one of the places that they were plotting all this out was in New York, because New York is a neutral country. The British Crown has no authority over what people are doing there, and therefore German diplomats, military agents, and Irish nationalists could get together and plot running guns into Ireland and starting a rebellion. And the British knew this was going on. So, Quinn not only is connected to those Irish circles, not only can he provide Crowley with introductions there, but guess what else he's connected to? The British consulate and British intelligence. Because what Quinn did in his spare time was to inform upon his Irish nationalist friends to officials in the British consulate. So when Crowley arrives in New York, he is met by an Irish American who is a British intelligence asset. And then Crowley himself presents himself, remember this whole point that he's English in background, as suddenly an Irish patriot. There's nothing Irish about it. It's completely phony. But he goes through, there's this whole elaborate thing he goes through that actually gets covered in the New York Times. They actually have a New York Times reporter to do this. And he and some of his followers, they go out, they get a boat, and they have a fiddle player going. I think it's one of his girlfriends at the time, Lila Waddell. They go to the Statue of Liberty, and he tears up what is supposed to be his British passport. It's not. It's an envelope. And proclaims the birth of an Irish republic and their undying loyalty to the new Irish state. Well, this is a stunt for the press. It's a stunt for the American press. And it was largely meant to impress the Germans, British, anybody else who was looking, that, well, this apparently is some sort of fanatical Irishman. He never had much success in convincing any of the Irish nationalists of this, because I think they could sort of spot him a mile away. I mean, they never took him into their circles. But the Germans did. And in fact, one of the people who it brings him in, I mentioned this.
Wait, so back up for a second. You're saying after World War I, or in that era, is that when he was joined, or the Germans brought him in at that time?
Yeah, this is in fact, he gets admitted to the German propaganda cabinet. Remember, I mentioned that there was a German publication, or pro-German, a publication that became pro-German called The Fatherland. And it was edited by a fellow by the name of George Sylvester Viereck, who, among other things, liked to claim he was the illegitimate son of the Kaiser, but probably not true, or the grandson of the Kaiser. George Sylvester Viereck was a German-American, absolutely devoted to Germany and to the Kaiser, and he became the effective head of German propaganda in the U.S. He was also closely linked to the German military and naval attaché, and links going all the way up to the German embassy in Washington, and that also made him privy to some of the sabotage plans, which remember I said that American factories were producing weapons and munitions for the British and the French?
Yes.
Well, one of the ways to stop that was to have factories suddenly blow up. So the Germans, unable to buy up supplies, did in fact create a campaign of sabotage in the U.S., and there were munitions factories and others that exploded. So this was what I meant by a real war, which had its sort of battles and casualties that were going on. Well, Crowley is taken in by Viereck, brought into the offices of the Fatherland, later sets in on meetings of the propaganda cabinet, and in doing so, he manages to place himself in the middle of German intrigue in New York. There's no better place for a British agent or asset to be, and he had pulled that off. So the question is, why? Now, why would this guy was not a terribly convincing Irishman, so I could never believe that was entirely the explanation for it. The explanation goes back to a thing you mentioned earlier, the OTO, this mystical society that was originally formed in Germany, and then which Crowley would later become the head of, and this sort of tells us how he got there. Well, the fellow who was the head of the OTO before Crowley was a German, a fellow by the name of Theodor Reuss. And Theodor Reuss had been involved in, guess what? German intelligence. And in fact, he had been living in England, almost certainly involved in intelligence operations back in 1910 and 1911, and it was Reuss who around 1910 recruited and initiated Crowley into the OTO, which was a German secret society, and then named him head of the new English and American versions. Now, it's Royce's connection to German intelligence and the fact that during the war, the same time that Crowley's in New York, right, Royce is working for German intelligence in Berlin and in Switzerland. It's Royce who vouches for Crowley.
Really?
Because in piecing this together, okay, and I have to admit that I'm creating a speculatively networker, but if you look at what do we know? Royce, before and during the war, is connected to German intelligence. He is in England in 1910, technically on other business, newspapers, and otherwise, but I'll bet you that he's involved in running agents. That's what he did later on. That's what we would have done then. And he recruits Crowley, I would suspect, because the idea of using Crowley as a German agent. And this gets into the idea you mentioned before about Crowley being a double agent or a triple agent or flipping one side or another.
That's right.
In 1910, Theodor Reuss thought that he had recruited Crowley as a potential agent for Germany. Therefore, when Crowley goes to New York posing as a potential, that's how he gets into the German inner circle. It is Reuss in Berlin who says, yeah, this guy's okay. I initiated him into my secret society. I trust him. So there are different levels of sort of play acting and deception taking place. You have Crowley, who was ostensibly recruited as a German double agent years before, who's now actually working for the British, pretending to be a German agent, pretending to be an Irish nationalist. So many of these that's what I mean with these kind of performances or acts that are being put on. Never pay much attention to what people, it's the old thing of know what they do in public, but in terms of what they do and say in private. So Crowley's position in this, I could sort of, seeing here, was important. And this is why later on you have the U.S. Deputy Attorney General Becker, who is defending Crowley in 1918, saying, look, he supplied me with all of the information on these, and including Virek. One of the people that Becker later investigated and actually tried to arrest, although they couldn't get him, was George Sylvester Virek, the very man that Crowley had been closest to. The other thing is that years later, Crowley and Virek remain sort of, I'm not sure friends is the word, but they remain at least speaking acquaintances all the way through the 1930s. And Virek certainly realizes by that time that Crowley had betrayed him. Yet they still maintain some kind of relationship to each other. I don't think they ever really trust each other, but they can use each other. And that's one of the things that I've seen in so much of the sort of, in many ways, kind of underworld that I explore, is that there's not a lot of trust or friendship. There is a lot of mutual exploitation. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, one of the reasons you can trust a person is because you know you can't trust them. But this way, because you know that they are, let's say, entirely mercenary and will do anything for money, you understand what their limitations are. And you don't trust them any more than is absolutely safe to do under the circumstances. So the mere fact that this person is often unreliable and greedy and will turn on you if they get a better offer, well, as long as you know what you're dealing with, you can use them to your advantage. And that's something that I think Crowley, in much of his career, was quite adept at doing. He's a good judge of people. And he can
in other words, you're saying more he was a selfish person. So if offered the right sum of money or promotion or something that would benefit him, he wouldn't care where his loyalties would lie, in other words.
In Crowley's case, I don't think that's true. I don't think Crowley was mercenary. I think that he could spot a mercenary element in other people, and if you realize that's what makes them tick, if you realize that money is what motivates them, then you have the key to motivating them. Crowley, on the other hand, was something else again. Crowley, and I think you could get different interpretations, but I'll stick with mine. Crowley to me was someone who, at bottom, was a devoted, patriotic Englishman. And he did what he did, as strange as it may seem, out of his version of love of country.
For his love of the UK, obviously.
Yeah. And I think particularly of what he saw as England, something even maybe more parochial than just that. He actually gave an anecdote that I think explains this. And I think it was about his it's about the idea, he said that, I don't believe for a moment, again, I'm going to have to paraphrase what he was saying here, I don't believe for a moment that the English kettle is any less black than the German pot. In other words, I don't believe that England has some moral superiority over Germany. That's not what my loyalty is based on. But what my loyalty is based on, he goes, is that simply that England is my country. If Germany was my country, I would be loyal to it. And he uses this, I remember this phrase in particular, mine is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. Although he starves me and he beats me, I am his dog, and I love him.
Interesting.
And that to me sort of rang true. What he was saying is that, I don't love England because I think that God is on its side. I don't love England because it's always been kind to me, or that there are elements that are things it just comes down to this visceral education. I'm an Englishman. This is my country. It's at war, and I support it. That's what I do. Crowley also on occasions would talk about what he really wanted to do, something that was this kind of alter ego, was to be an English country gentleman.
Meaning?
That, to be almost, to live a kind of normal, conventional life in some way.
But he did the opposite.
Yes, but he goes, but then you have this dichotomy of him doing things that directly enrage. I mean, he would openly do things that would mock conventions and that would enrage sensibilities. I mean, there's a reason why he was called the wickedest man in the world, because he kind of went out of his way to create that image. But it's an image that, if you look at him by the time you get to the 1930s, he has really sort of backfired. And in the early 30s, he has some friends in the press, and he tries to mount this counter campaign to sort of redeem his reputation. And this in particular is a period where he starts making these references to, I really work, all this idea about me being a traitor during the war isn't true. I can't tell you all of the background of it, but I was really serving Britain's interests. And that turns out, he's not lying when he says that. So it's, I think he's more often in these statements of being truthful, and rather than trying to make, he's not making that up. That, in fact, is true. Guy Gott was a real intelligence officer. Crowley is connected with it. The problem here is that one of the things you run across that's always hanging over this is the Defense of the Realm Act and the Official Secrets Act. So if the question is, why didn't Crowley write about his wartime experiences? Why didn't he come clean and come up with this stuff? It's because he would have been prosecuted if he did. He knew that you don't do that.
Yeah, that's because you would have violated the intelligence laws. You know,
Right.
Just like if you're a spy for the CIA, you don't go to the time during the Cold War to the Soviet Union and spill your secrets. That would be counterproductive.
And anybody who spends several hours telling you about that they're a spy and the rest of it most probably isn't.
That's right.
Okay. So he knew the limit, and in fact, he was sort of pushing the envelope even by mentioning people like Gaunt and others that he knew. And it was, I think the way to describe Crowley in this case is that he's not an intelligence officer, which would mean that he actually would hold a rank or, a position, a paid job within the ranks of, there aren't many of those people who do it. He is an agent in the sense of being an asset. If you want to take it down, he is an informant. He is an element within that apparatus which is sent in. And the important part in that is that the connection has to be informal. There are not supposed to be any direct links.
Because if there were, then he obviously wouldn't have been able to get so close to Nazi Germany, right?
Right. Well, there or at any time. I mean, if he'd gotten that commission in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, well, then his name is going to be on a list somewhere.
That's right.
Of volunteer naval officers. Therefore, for him to impersonate an Irish nationalist and to infiltrate the German circles in New York with the chance that would be found out would destroy it. So that's one of the ideas that there can't be any kind of there can't be any kind of
links
of commission for you, because that would tie us directly together.
Well,
that is something. In fact, your activities are supposed to make it look like that is the last thing that's possible.
That's right. The whole point is to be clandestine. But hold that thought. We are going to take a break. As soon as we come back, we got so much more, including the 1941 Rudolf Hess landing from Nazi Germany to the UK to try to broker some peace treaty or some other. There's so much more to this story. Everybody stay tuned. We return much, much more from Dr. Richard Spence.
This is Travis Walton, and you're listening to DrJ Radio Live.
Attention Dark Matter Radio listeners. Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to every minute of the Dark Matter Radio Network by calling 605-562-4444. No smartphone, app or internet is needed. Saves your data plan and no extra cost if you have unlimited minutes. Dial 605-562-4444 to listen to the Dark Matter Radio Network on any phone, anytime, anywhere.
Welcome back to Hour 2 of DrJ Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J. And if you've caught us fairly late, we have been speaking to Dr. Richard Spence on his awesome book, Secret Agent 666, Aliester Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. The reason why I brought him on was really for what we're leading up, for what we've been speaking for this past hour, which you're going to hear some explosive, awesome evidence this hour. Everything that ties in the fact of the Nazi Germany having an occult interest, and of course the possibility that Aliester Crowley himself was a double, if not triple agent, feeding both sides of the war, the Allies and the Axis, intelligence information. It's the espionage factor that I truly like about this. And when I did my research on Crowley himself, that's when I found such, crazy things written about this guy that I had to find out more. And that's exactly why I brought Dr. Richard Spence on. Dr. Spence, you've written several books. Why don't we talk about the other books real quick and where people can find this book that we're speaking on today?
Well, certainly Secret Agent 666 is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the usual outlets. And other books I've written a book called Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. That's the book I was writing when it bumped into the file on Crowley. I don't know what to say about Riley. Riley's, he had his own television show back years. I mean, not television show, but there was a mini-series which was made out of him, which started a whole cottage industry about Sidney Riley and probably jump-started Sam Neill's career. I would just say that anybody who has ever seen the Riley Ace of Spies miniseries, it's very entertaining. It is 90% bunk. The real story is arguably more interesting. Another character who sort of created himself. First book I wrote was actually a biography of a Russian revolutionary by the name of Boris Savinkov. That's called Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left. That was actually published back in the early 90s. Pretty hard to come by today. I probably couldn't afford a copy of it. And then I also co-authored with Walter Bosley a few years ago, partly because of the Secret Agent 666 book. Walter Bosley was a writer and researcher who lives in Southern California. And he was interested in, I guess you could call it a kind of paranormal linked murder case in 1915 San Bernardino. Lots of really creepy stuff that went on. And he thought that there was a Crowley link to that. Not sure the Crowley link. He did actually pass through town about a week before this happened, but that I'll chalk up to coincidence. But that book emerged as Empire of the Wheel, which tells it, and Walter has since carried that saga on further. But it's rather a kind of interesting exploration of a whole string of what appear to be initially unrelated, mysterious deaths, and then the more you look at them, they're not so unrelated, and trying to figure out what's behind it. So yeah, that's that. I've also written many articles, most of them dealing with intelligence related or espionage. I tend to chase spies. I guess that's one way of putting it. I'm always trying to figure out whether this person was a spy or who they actually were. I guess in some way, somebody said once that, you actually should have been a cop. I'd never thought about that before it's a career option, but maybe there's something to it. But to me, the interesting part is sort of is winkling out secrets in seeing something that hadn't been seen before. And that was one of the things that intrigued me in Crowley's case, because I was piecing together an aspect of this man's life which had been studied on numerous occasions by many people and had done very thorough jobs of it. But basically the whole idea of any relationship between he and the government and intelligence operations had been pretty much dismissed. I mean, this is one of the things you find. Often things are unknown not because they're unknowable, but because nobody bothers to look for them.
Well, that's why I'm so thankful I was able to find your book, because that was the first time I was able to get the link between the British intelligence and, of course, World War II with the wickedest man who lived. I got a couple questions that are actually decades apart, but we do have one listener question. I don't know where it fits in, but I'm just going to read it. Sean from TuneIn asks, Dr. Spence, do you have any knowledge of the international news of the Nazi gold train found?
Oh, you mean the train that was supposedly found in Poland?
I believe so. I'm just reading it word for word.
I only know the articles that I saw in the paper. And it was supposedly a train, what they think was a train loaded with gold that sounds to me like it was put into a cave or into some kind of underground bunker and possibly booby-trapped. I don't know. It's one of those things that maybe it'll turn out to be an actual lost Nazi gold train, and maybe it will turn out to be nothing. Well, show me the train.
Yes.
Okay, that's
and the context.
Response to it. Just show me the train, and then we'll know what it is.
No.
So until the train appears, and we're talking about something it might be. On the other hand, Nazi trains laden with gold and loot coming out of Eastern Europe are not a figment of somebody's imagination. They existed. Whether that's one, we'll wait and see.
Yes. Now, this is what I was meaning by different decades, literally, World War I and World War II. Back to World War I, when we talked about Aliester Crowley showing up to New York on the Lusitania on Halloween of all days.
Yeah.
6 months later, I believe, or something along the lines of that, the Lusitania was blown up. A lot of people think that was either a false flag or a big catalyst to spur the war even more. Some rumors speculate that Crowley had something to do with the blowing up the Lusitania. Do you know anything about that?
Well, it's what he may have had to do with it, and this is arguable, but the Lusitania was sunk, I think, on the 7th of May, 1915. So it is going to about half a year later. And that sinking drowned a number of Americans. Over 120 Americans were drowned among the 1,000 people who died. It was sunk by a U-boat off the coast of southern Ireland. The Lusitania case is one of those things that is still sort of raked over the coals today, back and forth, because there are a lot of unanswered questions about it. One of the things that the subsequent Board of Inquiry in the U.S. found was that it was carrying war-related supplies. And therefore, the German sinking of it, while not basically a nice thing to do, was legitimate.
Military tactic.
They had cause to do so because it was part of the Cunard Lines. It was being used to carry war materials. Now, true, one of the arguments, it's not carrying shells, it's carrying shell casings and explosives that will be used to make shells, but, I think that's kind of splitting hairs. It was carrying war-related materials. The British also early in the war had briefly listed it as an auxiliary cruiser, which they then dropped, but then that still appeared on lists as an auxiliary cruiser, but it was being used to carry war-related materials, and it was also being used to carry passengers. And frankly, one of the reasons that was done, did somebody screw up and forget this was a passenger ship? No, that was done deliberately. It was done deliberately under the idea that we can stick all of these war materials in the hold of this ship, and because it's a passenger ship, you don't dare sink it.
Now going a couple decades later, now to World War II, it's no mystery that there was a lot of interest from the top Nazi leaders into the occult. As a matter of fact, the swastika was an occult symbol that they used and adopted as Nazi Germany, which is now forever ruined because anytime someone sees that, of course, they link it to the 50 million people that died because of World War II, not to mention including in that figure the 10+ million people that were executed by the Nazis.
Yeah.
Now, there were several people, including Hitler himself, who had astrologers and psychics and mediums around him. But Rudolf Hess, I think, took it to the extreme in 1941 when he himself boarded a plane with nobody else, decided to go to England to sort of, was it broker a peace treaty, and ended up being captured. What is the link between that 1941 flight and Crowley and maybe the occultism in general?
Okay. Well, there are a lot of questions there. And again, we're sort of going to have to go back and work forward again because it's one of those things that takes some time to develop. The Nazis and the occult are, you can find any number of books on it. I don't know. The History Channel, which some people used to call the Hitler Channel, has every week I see something about the Nazis and the occult.
Yes.
It's almost a cottage industry in that, and there certainly is something there. I'd say that you again should read widely and critically any kind of material. Some is more, I think, reliable than others, but you can trace there were connections between the founding of the Nazi Party right after World War I. And I think something that maybe Peter Levenda meant. Did he mention the Thule Society?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, okay. The Thule Society is that thing for anybody who's seen the first Hellboy movie that they mispronounce as the Thule Society. But it's spelled Thule, but Thule Society, just like the, brand of ski gear. The Thule Society was, one of these things that seemed to pop up like, toadstools everywhere. An initiatory, mystical society, a kind of mystical brotherhood. Who doesn't want to have their own secret society? Well, this had developed in Berlin actually before and during the war, and there's a pretty good argument to be made if you look at the correspondence and personnel that the initial Nazi Party, or what was then just called the German Workers' Party, was the kind of political end of the Thule Society. or that what the Thule Society did was to create a political party, and that was it. So there is a link between those. There's this kind of, almost a kind of birth of the Nazi movement within this kind of occultish or sort of mystical secret society. Now you get a lot of arguments as to how important that becomes. So there are people, and it's not an argument we're going to settle here, but there are those who would argue that, well, the Thule Society, there's a connection between the two in personnel, but really that's kind of minimal. It's unimportant. You don't need to pay much attention to that. Maybe you should. Others argue that no, that this is absolutely critical. If you want to understand everything that the Nazi Party was, you must understand its kind of the mystical roots of it. So this is what spawns the whole, again, cottage industry exploring the Nazis and the cult. So there is a connection there. And it's one of those things that then runs through Hitler himself. I don't think Hitler was the center of it. Hitler's interest in occult matters seems to have been, well, let's put it this way. Hitler was not nearly as interested in these things as Rudolf Hess was. Hess, who was very close to Hitler, particularly early on, in fact, up until the late 30s, Hess was sort of Hitler's right-hand man. Hess was a true believer in many things. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was as well, in a slightly different. I mean, this is not at all unusual. If you poke around, you tend to find different levels of it. I mean, we've got this whole radio show and the listeners. Who isn't interested in these things? Okay. Say the word occult and secret society, and all right.
And intelligence, and British intelligence.
And people are immediately intrigued by these things. Yeah. So, Crowley's, there is this, and it's one of the things I think that I try to eventually build up in the book, is that, and it was something that became more and more apparent to me that I was writing it, is that Crowley, in sort of representing this connection between the world of occultism and the world of intelligence, is not unique. There's nothing unique about him. In fact, the more I began to look at this and the more the pieces began to come together, you sort of realize that there is this very long and complex relationship between what is roughly called occultism or occult-linked secret societies and intelligence agencies. I'm not sure I can thoroughly explain why, but it's there. And so in a way, Crowley, as opposed to being someone who you would think that, well, no self-respecting intelligence agency would ever touch this guy with a 10-foot pole, in some ways he was perfect for the job he did. And what made him perfect, and what makes most successful agents perfect, is that they have connections. So, let me give you, remember I was mentioning I'd written a book on this fellow Sidney Riley.
Yes.
Sidney Riley was an utterly untrustworthy person. Riley is the example of someone who is basically mercenary. And this is something that everybody who dealt with him pretty much knew. And yet he was engaged for a secret mission into Bolshevist Russia by the head of British intelligence, the head of what would become MI6, personally engaged him, even though the head of MI6 had been clearly informed this man was utterly unscrupulous and unreliable and would exploit any situation to his own advantage. So the question is, why would anybody in their right mind hire him? Well, the reason for that was very simple. He had connections that other people didn't have. And those connections allow him to get information that we can't get any other way. So you see, we don't trust him. We don't like him. In fact, we know that we can't thoroughly trust him. But we will use him for what we can. So in some ways, it's similar with Crowley. It's not that there were people who, in intelligence or in government or elsewhere, who liked him. In fact, most of them loathed him. Because there's an incident in the mid-1920s, which is a kind of low point in Crowley's life and his career. And it's pretty clear that he's basically been cut off by most people who know him, and he's living in France, and he's, really impoverished. And this is also a period when he's suffering from his heroin addiction. And there's a question that comes up about exploring, this question sort of comes through British intelligence circles about the idea of certain questionable secret societies in the Far East. And what they're sort of after is whether or not there are maybe Soviet or Japanese connections to them, which in some cases, by the way, there were. So the question is, who could possibly sort of give us any kind of insight in this, who could explore it? And Crowley's name comes up. And there are people who just want, we want nothing to do, we want nothing to do with him. But as one person puts it, he goes, well, he is very knowledgeable about these things. However, disagreeable or odious he might be in some ways, no one would have better information on this than he. So perhaps we should hold our nose and make use of him once again. It's pretty clear, this again is something that would come out of the book, but it's pretty clear that his activities in both during World War I and after ran into some problems. He was in some ways not the most successful. He compromised himself in certain ways, and that along with his personal traits made him something that they wanted to keep it sort of arm's length, but again, if you really need someone who knows that, we'll bring him in.
Dr. Spence, there's actually 4 listener questions I've piled up so far. Some are more broad. Again, if you want to pass by them, by all means. So I'm just going to read one after the other. Let's go back to the oldest one. Let's see here. This is from Steve from San Francisco. Asks, how much of Hitler's occult history was affected by his drug addiction that was fed by his doctors?
Well, particularly Dr. Morell, who was his kind of Dr. Feelgood. That's something that, I'm not sure I could address too thoroughly. Hitler certainly became dependent on drugs in the latter part of his life. He may have used them earlier on. And again, who's a pioneer in that? Aliester Crowley. Maybe he gave him lessons. It's one of the things that would be hard to say. That is, did Hitler believe in the occult because he was on drugs? I guess the other way to put it, was he on drugs because he believed in the occult?
It's true. It could answer it either way.
Yeah.
All right. Here is the other one. Michael Fairfax from Norfolk, Virginia asks, does Dr. Spence have any knowledge of the Spear of Destiny and the part it played in World War II?
Only what I read in Trevor Ravenscroft's book and other critiques of that. And I think some of your listeners may know what that is. That's for the Spear of Destiny. That's the spear that
pierced Christ.
Longinus, that pierced the side of Christ, and whoever possesses it will rule the world. And I don't think you needed to explain Hitler or World War II. I think it may have played a role, but if it wasn't there, it wouldn't make any difference.
It's true. But he did go out of his way to get that was for sure.
Well, that was in Vienna, too, so he had a particular affection for that as well. I mean, why? I mean, look, even if you don't have to believe in this, if other people believe in it, that may be one. If other people believe this has power, and you have it, they think you have power. It's
true. That is true. It just is, what do they call it? A placebo effect, in other words.
A placebo effect, or, you don't know whether it does it, but, they think if you have I don't know if it's the Spear of Destiny or a crystal skull, they're cool things to have. And beyond that, other people will be impressed by the fact you have them. And if they are magic, so much the better.
Now, here is the third question. This is Sean from TuneIn. He asks, a lot of popular occult of Nazis are abound. What does Dr. Spence know that can amaze us?
What do I know that can amaze you? Well, that's kind of... Let me bring it... This brings us back to Crowley and the Nazis and Germany and things leading up to Hess, but about a decade earlier, and it's not in the book. So it's up, the reader decides, or the listener decides whether this is amazing. But it is one of those things that I didn't come across when I was writing the book. It's really come up since. And around 1930, that is, as the Weimar Republic, as the pre-Nazi government was collapsing, and as the Nazis are rising very rapidly to become a major power, and it was headed towards the chancellorship. During that time in Berlin, which was known for its nightlife and entertainment, there was a very popular stage entertainer by the name of Erik Jan Hannesson. And some people may have heard of him, probably most people haven't. But Hannesson, even though Americans today haven't heard of him, was a big deal, was a big name in Berlin in that period. And what he was is that he was a mentalist. He was a clairvoyant, a stage psychic. He's sort of a combination of mind reader and magician, put on a big stage act. But he was also an astrologer, okay? And Hannesson became very close with the leaders of the rising Nazi Party, including Hitler, that he was introduced to in 1932. We know they met a few times. It's unclear. They might have known each other before. Hannesson gave Hitler some kind of instruction on public speaking and on gestures. This was one of those things, and Hannesson would have been the person to do it. I don't think he taught Hitler how to speak in public, because Hitler had been doing that quite successfully for some time. But one of the things that really attracted Hitler to Hannesson is that Hannesson, in his very popular weekly magazines and his astrological magazines, began to promote the Nazi Party, and he began to predict their electoral victories, and eventually to predict Hitler's rise to power. And Hitler was very anxious to hear these things, became intrigued by it, and again, it was other people within the SS, in fact, or within the Brown Shirt organization. There was a guy by the name of Count von Helldorf, who was the head of the Brown Shirts in Berlin, that was really quite a close friend of Hannesson, and helped bring him into contact. So Hannesson is this he's a celebrity. And Hannesson mixed with all sorts of very wealthy people. This will give you a key into Hannesson's background. Hannesson had a yacht which he kept anchored in a lake outside of Berlin, and he hosted parties on that yacht. And those parties got pretty wild. And he filmed them, and then subsequently used them, we must suspect, for blackmail purposes. So he was very wealthy, very influential, and was himself admitted to the Brown Shirts. He actually had a uniform and went on. Well, here's the secret that some people may know to Hannesson. Erik Jan Hannesson was not his real name. His real name was Herschmann Steinschneider. He was from Czechoslovakia originally, or what would become Czechoslovakia, and he was Jewish. That created some problems. Now, the odd thing is that many of the Nazis who were dealing with Hannesson knew of his Jewish background. In fact, he didn't really try that hard to hide it. And what eventually would get Hannesson into what would be a fatal mistake, arguably, is that not long after Hitler came to power, the Reichstag burned down. Anybody has heard of the Reichstag fire? And this was the German parliament caught fire and burned. And the importance of that is that the burning of the Reichstag was blamed on a communist conspiracy, and as a result, Hitler got what was called the Enabling Act. He got emergency powers. And that's what really begins the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship. Hannesson had predicted the burning of an important building about 24 hours before. So the assumption is that when about 2 weeks later, Hannesson's decomposing body, riddled with bullets, is found in a wood south of Berlin, it was because he had sort of outlived his usefulness. Okay, that he had, because it somehow suggested that since he knew this and he was close to the Nazis, that it was too close to revealing the secret, which was that the Nazis burned the Reichstag, which they did, or at least arranged it. The other thing about Hannesson is that he was a master hypnotist. Okay, so the question is, that's interesting in itself, what might that have to do with Aliester Crowley? You know who else was spending most of his time in Berlin during this same period from 1930 to 1932 when all these things are happening?
Who?
Crowley.
Oh.
Crowley's in Berlin. He is in Hannesson's Berlin. Now, the one thing that I have looked everywhere I can think of, in his remaining diaries and elsewhere, trying to tap into different sources, is that did Crowley make, and he writes about lots of things. Crowley was kind of a habitual diary keeper, although they're often You often can't tell who he's talking about because occasionally he'll decide that he has to talk about them in some sort of mystical name or number and tell us thing exactly who they are. But this much I'm certain of. Given Crowley's interests, there is no way that he would have ignored the presence of Honnison. You couldn't ignore him. Honnison was a big name. He would have been aware of this, and he would have been intrigued by it. One of the things that Crowley was very interested in were any kind of psychics and stage magicians, and one of the things about them is he considered almost all of them fakes. This may or may not be something some of your listeners know. Crowley hated mediums.
Psychic mediums.
Mediums and, of spiritualists. He considered them at worst fakers, and if not, even something beyond that.
Like Houdini. He hated him.
Well, yes, and they actually shared that in common. Okay, it's something else that was something that they had in common. I can't put them in a room together either, but if they were going to sit down and have a conversation, they were certainly one thing they hated in this case. So Crowley would have been intensely intrigued by Honnison. So, as strange as it may seem, the mere fact that there's nothing, apparently anything that Crowley has written where he mentions Honnison, is kind of significant by its absence. That is, it's one of those things he could not have been aware of, and you would expect some sort of casual reference to it, and there's nothing which is there. Crowley also was interested in hypnosis. In fact, very skilled in hypnosis himself. This would one of the key things he would have picked up on. Now, one of the questions about why Honnison was killed and by whom. Okay, one, the common argument is the Nazis found out he was a Jew, but they already knew that already. Another idea is that a lot of them owed him money. Well, of course, they killed him. They weren't going to borrow any more money, and there was no sign that he was pressing for the debts. But the other possibility is that they found out he was a spy for someone. Because Honnison, by befriending, becoming close to members of the Nazi elite, by getting some of those people in compromising positions on film and the parties on his yacht, by being introduced to Hitler and apparently having some kind of influence with him, if you found out this person had been ratting on you or had contacts elsewhere, that would make you get rid of him. So who would be very interested? Think of it this way. Think of it. What intelligence agency on Earth, whether British, French, Soviet, whatever, which of them would not in this period have wanted to recruit Honnison into their service?
All of them.
Every single one of them.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, it's one of those things, I can't say I found it yet, but I know it's there, and I'm going to keep looking for it. That's, I'm convinced, is what got Honnison killed. And my theory in this, remember, not a fact, but a theory, is that one of the things that Crowley was doing in Berlin was either monitoring Honnison and his connections, or did he actually recruit him? They had a lot of things that they could talk about. They could talk about stage magic, hypnotism. They could talk about appearing to be. Honnison again is someone who appears to be something that he's not. Crowley is a person who spent his career playing a role, or several roles in this case. And there is a connection between Honnison and Crowley. I am certain of it. I may never find it, but that's one of the unanswered questions in this I really want to continue to explore, so it's not a finished story.
Dr. Spence, we got a couple more listener questions, and we've got about 20 minutes left, so let me try to get this in. This one is, I think, more broad and refers to the Nazis. The South, this is from Dan, by the way, Twitter name @DonDanL. The South Thule Island exists in the South Pacific near Antarctica. Did they end up there? Nazis, I'm assuming.
On South Thule Island? No, I thought they were supposed to end up in Antarctica in some sort of underground base. The South, I'm
actually glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the other, someone else sent a tweet, referring to that.
I think it's, if that happened and they went further, the Thule, Thule was the the old Germanic form of Hyperborea. It was a mystical land that lay in the far north. And South Thule Island was just named because it was close to the polar regions there. I don't think there's no connection between that. It's the Thule Society and South Thule Island both take their names from the same mythical polar realm. That's about it.
Here's the other one, and this goes specific to what you've been talking about and your book. Do you have any specific, or does Dr. Spence have any specific information or that disinformation that Crowley fed to the Nazis, or conversely, any information Crowley fed to the British that would have aided the Allies during World War II?
That gets it. Well, that brings us up to the element. Maybe we've been advertising this as we've gone through. Rudolf Hess. All right. So what I was just talking about was Crowley's presence in Berlin when the Nazis are rising to power. Now, by the way, he gets out of Berlin in the middle of 1932, in part because his presence was unpalatable to the German government at the time. There are many questions as to whether or not Crowley made any return trips to the German Reich in the 1930s and the years following. Officially, no, and I couldn't find any evidence of them. I mean, it's one of those things that, would be kind of hard to find to begin with, but it's possible that he did or he didn't. But what happened, one of the things that he formed in this period is that Crowley did have connections. One of the people he was still connected to was the guy I mentioned, George Sylvester Viereck, who, remember, had been a great fan of the Kaiser in the First War.
Yes.
Well, guess what? In the 30s, Viereck becomes a great proponent of Hitler. Okay, he's just a German propagandist all over again, but for the Nazi regime. Crowley is still, on speaking terms with him. They still communicate with each other. Although, again, that both these men know that they can't entirely trust each other. So, why is that? Did Crowley have something over Viereck? Did Viereck have something over Crowley? Was it just two sort of arch conspirators who just enjoy each other's company? But there were long-standing connections to German connections that Crowley could exploit. Now, the interesting thing to me is that during the 1930s, especially in the latter part of the 30s, this again is one of the things that's discussed more thoroughly in the book, Crowley becomes very close to an Englishman and officer by the name of Robin Thynne, Phynne. Very peculiar guy. Thynne later dies somewhat mysteriously and suddenly, I think just before the war begins. But Thynne himself, Thynne is another one of Crowley's, Thynne is clearly involved in intelligence activities. And these activities include dealings with anti-Nazi German occultists in Switzerland. Okay. All right. So that is, there are lots of that these are Germans who have gone into exile in Switzerland. They're apparently connected to some sort of what somebody presumes is an occult organization, and Thynne is dealing with them. And Crowley's relationship with Thynne and Thynne's connection to these exiled German occultists is not accidental. Crowley himself is a kind of link because he's the historical link between them. So you've got Crowley on the edges of a very sort of murky pre-war and early war British intelligence monitoring of German opposition groups. And that's something, again, I think that many of your listeners, if they've run across, if you've seen the Tom Cruise movie, there were repeated attempts to assassinate Hitler.
Yes.
I
think that was the Valkyrie. I think that was like the 20th one, if I'm not mistaken.
Almost the 20th, yes. Yeah. And most of them were at the hands of the army or by various sort of right-wing military circles. But there were repeated attempts. So there's a real opposition there. I mean, that's, Hitler did have something to worry about in terms of people killing him. They weren't particularly adept at carrying that out, but they were always plotting them. So this opposition existed. And it's one of those things that British intelligence seems never have known quite how to exploit, to use in some way. But that, again, that's one of the places where Crowley is the man that you need. Who's the guy who has some kind of personal links? Who can speak to these people in ideas that they can understand? Who is the kind of inside track? Well, even though he's old and heroin addicted and broke in this period.
Well, he wasn't the only one that was addicted to heroin. We also got to remember Herman Goering.
Oh, yeah. The difference, I don't know how many of your listeners know as to why Crowley is addicted to heroin.
I don't.
He used ether and mescaline and other drugs recreationally or for ritual purposes. He's addicted to heroin because it was given to him as a treatment for his asthma.
Oh, wow.
And that was, you either suffered from asthma or you became a junkie. And then I guess he also, sort of liked it. But that, again, is one of the things that sort of torments him on and off. Towards the latter part of his life, he just gives up trying to fight it. And dies as a thoroughgoing stone junkie, taking a dose that probably would have killed 5 of the men by that time. But,
well, it's funny you actually mentioned that because when Bayer first introduced heroin, the first ad, I believe it was 1898, was the ultimate cough suppressant.
Yeah, okay. It's it's like cigarettes apparently are good for tuberculosis. Okay, they'll give you cancer, but they're good for tuberculosis. It's a trade-off. So Crowley had the connections that would be useful, but as the 30s are going on, his health is declining, his position is declining. But this to me was a very important little clue. When the war breaks out, Crowley gets a contact from the new head of naval intelligence, and in fact, he's given a number to contact. He offers his services as well, but they call him up, the new chief of naval intelligence, pretty much the same outfit he'd been most closely associated with all along, gives him a number to contact, and I had a friend of mine who among other things, collects World War II intelligence agency phone numbers. Okay, that's a real hobby for you.
Yeah.
But he was able to figure out what the extension that Crowley was giving to it, and it went to the office that dealt with POW interrogations.
Wow.
So,
why that?
Right at the beginning of the war, Crowley is somehow brought in and connected to an office that deals with POW interrogations.
I wonder if it has to do with the fact that you said he was into hypnosis, because a lot of people know that the CIA in the 70s and 80s and MK Ultra and everything else was using these type of enhanced interrogation techniques, including hypnosis.
Right, and he'd been experimenting in that. But one of the things that he did, even back in World War I, he was a pioneer in the use of mescaline, essentially synthesized peyote. And he would he would invite people to dinner. He would fix them a spicy meal like a curry, and he would dose them with mescaline or other drugs, not take it himself, and then record their reactions.
Kind of like Charles Manson when he used to take the family, give them all LSD, but not take it himself.
Yeah, and then watch what it was that they do. So the thing is that was he doing this just because he was curious? Was this just Crowley playing scientist? Or was he keeping notes that could be useful to somebody else later on? And one of the things is that mescaline was one of the drugs that would be used, and that in fact is the very drug that Rudolf Hess in British captivity claims the British are dosing him with.
That I didn't.
He calls it, they're giving me Mexican brain poison.
That's
I've never heard it called that before, but he believed that they were and Hess was at least well enough acquainted with it, apparently, to know the effects. And he was convinced that in the place where he was being held, that he was being dosed with drugs. Why would he be dosed with drugs? Well, if he was, to see, the whole idea is whether you can get people talking or you can break them down and to open up the architecture of the mind. It's the same thing that MK Ultra would be, which I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of. Was
of course
just carried on the work, which in some way one could argue, Aliester Crowley was a pioneer of work later carried on by MK Ultra and others.
Dr. Spence, I know we're cutting it close on time. We have under 10 minutes left, but we do have one more listener question if you're interested in taking it. This is, again, Sean from TuneIn. He asks, why was Crowley connected to the sleeping prophets, whatever that means? Do you know what that means?
Sleeping prophet. The only sleeping prophet I can think of is Edgar Casey.
Ah, yes.
And I really, there I would have to say, is there a connection between Crowley and Edgar Casey? Never heard of one. I don't know.
I wouldn't be surprised, though, considering that was the same era and considering Crowley spent time in the eastern United States and around the world.
Well, I think most people listening have probably heard of the old 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yes.
Okay, well, you can also play a game called 6 Degrees of Aliester Crowley, but you generally only need about 2 or 3 degrees. He knew an incredible number of people, so I would not say that he and Edgar Casey never met. That would have nothing to substantiate that. But there's always if there's another group of sleeping prophets that they're talking about, then I don't know what that would be either. But there's very little that he probably wouldn't have been connected to, at least by 2 or 3 elements.
Did you come across any evidence that Hitler himself ever interacted with Crowley?
There are a variety of. I think there's actually one story out there somewhere that Crowley actually becomes Hitler or something, or was kind of his guru. That's the most common one. Is that you get this idea that Crowley was the one who taught Hitler his almost magical speaking techniques, or that he became his mentor in some way. I think that's a confusion with something. Those stories basically attribute to Crowley what it was that Hannesen basically did. So that to me is curious, because what it suggests is that somewhere along the line, Crowley and Hannesen have been conflated. That there's a kind of, even if they don't know they're making a connection to them, they're putting Crowley doing things that Hannesen did. So where did this whole idea crop up? This is what leads me to think that if you keep peeling the layers of the onion back far enough, you're going to will find that this connection between Crowley and Hannesen, and that's how somehow these two things were linked together. So I guess in the last few minutes, to leave people hanging on the Hess minutes. Yes, Rudolf Hess was very close to Hitler in 1941, as he described it, to broker a peace deal with pro-peace elements in Britain, and they were there. Okay, this was not something. Rudy wasn't hallucinating if he believed that there were powerful people in London who wanted to make peace with Nazi Germany. There were, and Churchill knew that as well. Because remember, this was a period of time before Hitler had invaded Russia, so there was no Eastern Front, in which he had the whole continent under his control, in which the British Army had been driven out of first France and then out of the Balkans and was barely holding on in the Middle East. That was a time that it made, in many ways, perfect sense to try to cut a deal with the Germans if you could. Hess believed he could negotiate that. One of the reasons why Churchill so feared that was because it actually brought up the possibility that was not something that he wanted. He was determined to continue the war, and therefore Hess had to be very quickly neutralized and put under wraps. But he was an important Nazi figure. He had been close to Hitler for years. He knew the psychology. He knew the secrets of the regime. And who wouldn't want to pick his brain apart one neuron at a time? And there's actually one, I can quote it in the book, that there was a very secretive British interrogation center, and it was sort of their equivalent of Guantanamo. It didn't actually exist, and it was called by a number of names. One of them was Ham Common, which was the place outside London where it was, but also 020 or O20, the special camp, and that's where high-level Nazi prisoners were taken for special interrogation. Officially, Rudolf Hess was never there. But according to one Nazi prisoner who was later released, and what he told someone else is that, yes, Hess was there, and not only was Hess there for a time, but while Hess was there, I saw Aliester Crowley there. Now, is this fellow just making this up? Is it just a story? Or it's some odd people sort of put together? But it's one of those things that's not nonsensical.
Well, let me ask you this while we're cutting. We only got a couple minutes left, and then I want to ask you final statements, of course. But if Hess went over to England to broker a peace treaty at a time when it would have been very beneficial because it was prior to the United States joining the war,
right?
Why would they imprison him, interrogate him, rather than actually try to reach peace and save millions of lives from dying?
Well, that gets into a lot of things. Part of it has to do with Hitler is planning to invade Russia. Remember, this is May of 1941, and then the invasion is going to come down on the 22nd of June, and intelligence lines were already buzzing with that. It was one of the things that Churchill was counting on, waiting to see that was going to happen. So the question is, if I think that, Winston Churchill was completely opposed to it, wisely or not necessarily, it was a practical idea, but he was waiting for something. He believed that America would eventually come into the war. If Hitler attacks Russia in the next few months, that takes the pressure off of it. So this is really not the time to make peace. Whereas others were arguing, to save the empire, we need to make some kind of deal. And it's so Hess's arrival it wasn't a fool's errand. I mean, he may have gone about it, and maybe not the most practical way, but it was a viable possibility, and he was a person who believed that he could carry this off. Didn't work out the way he planned, but...
Yeah, he spent the rest of the time in prison until the Nuremberg trials, the war trials.
And then years until, what did he die, like 1990?
Yeah, because didn't he break ranks and actually only serve a sentence rather than was sentenced to death?
He served life. He may have been sentenced to death, but he was given life.
Ah, gotcha.
And he actually is the last person to be in Spandau prison.
And one of the highest ranking ones at that, too.
Yeah. And it also, by all intents and purposes, goes... The general portrayal of Hess, common portrayal, is that he's nuts.
Yeah.
That he was sort of, loony to begin with, and then became increasingly nuts. And his whole trip to England, the idea was that his flight, actually he didn't fly to England, he flew to Scotland, but his flight to Scotland was the work of a madman. Well, it's really not the work of a madman. It may be the work of someone who's, didn't plan it out that well, and is desperate and is naive, but what he was trying to do was not crazy at all.
It was peace. It was trying to broker a peace treaty to stop the war, and that would have been something beneficial to everybody, including my own family, who I lost at the hands of the Nazis. Sadly, we are almost out of time. Dr. Richard Spence, it's been an honor. Your book really captivated me. I love espionage. Anything that has to do with intelligence is cool, and when you throw in the mix of the occult and World War II, I think it makes for a fascinating book. For everybody out there, be sure and check out Secret Agent 666, Aliester Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. Dr. Spence, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners any final words you have, as well as plug in any other books you have, and essentially whatever you want.
Okay, well, I guess I'd go back to what I said at the beginning, is that if you want to know more about Aliester Crowley, you can read my book, but read everything you can find on it. There are views that are very negative, there are views that are very positive, there are a few things like mine, I think, that are sort of in the middle, but that's the way in which eventually you can formulate. What you do is don't take my word for it or anybody else's word. Form your own opinions on this and everything else. Always explore, always learn. There's a lot of stuff in the book we didn't get around to, and there's a bit more in things that we did touch on. I guess I'd go back to plug my book on Riley, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, also available through Farrell House, and certainly the Empire of the Wheel, co-author with Walter Bosley. And anybody who's interested in, Russian revolutionaries who go back and forth, the Savinkov book, if you could find it, is a good read as well.
And
Thanks for having me on.
And we absolutely look forward to your next book, and we definitely have to do a follow-up to pick up where we left off because there's so much info that we didn't get to. Again, I want to thank you, everybody out there listening. Remember, this show is about you. You tell me who you want to hear. You tell me the topics, and I will make it happen. All you have to do is go to drjradiolive.com. Just remember that one word, Dr. J Radio Live. You could follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. That's the name of the YouTube channel where this will be posted and other. Speaking of YouTube channel, the Bill Burns video will be up tonight about Philip Corso. What is up is the Honorable Paul Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada, the highest ranking politician of the G8 countries, to speak out on conspiracies, including UFOs, ghosts, paranormal. Also, of course, Jeremy Corbell and Ruben Langdon. The Chris Geritano film on the Montauk Chronicles is released this Thursday right here on Dark Matter Digital Network. Join us with Jan Harzan, the MUFON executive director, who will be joining us for Hour 1. And Hour 2 will be taking open lines. If you guys got your own stories you'd like to tell, by all means, join in. It is your hour. This is for you. Once again, check out the channel. There's not only the interviews from this show are there, the old interviews from my older shows are up there, as well as footage provided by you, the listener. And, of course, there's some small exclusive YouTube interviews that are too short to make it to this network, and because they're not live. Astronauts, politicians, a former federal intelligence officer, and so much more. Again, all you have to do is go to the YouTube channel, Dr. J Radio Live, or drjradiolive.com, and that is where you'll find it. Remember, disclosure is in your hands. I want to thank again to my guest, Dr. Richard Spence. Of course, I want to thank my team, Dr. J Radio Live team. There are several of you out there, too many names to list. And the owner of the station, Keith Rowland, who does a lot of work to keep everything up and running. And the man who is coming on next, which you are all gearing up to hear, Art Bell. With that being said, this is Dr. J, Dr. J Radio Live, signing off.